Okay, hi Wolf, hi Skinner.
Hi, Matt.
Excited to be joining you guys to talk about the AI Conclave that we're doing in Spain in November.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
So I thought we could begin by describing our own backgrounds and sort of how we're coming at this question, why we're doing this conclave at all. Um, it seems to me that a lot of the time the AI questions are framed as sort of technical inevitability. But when you look at the way that people are thinking and talking about AI, it actually seems to be so much more of almost like a mirror on the human psychology, the particular philosophical and ideological assumptions and beliefs that people have coming into things. Uh, I'm wondering, Wolf, where do you come at these questions?
Yeah, so I was trained as a mechanical engineer. That I taught myself computer science on the side uh, during that time, actually, instead of doing homework. So I've always sort of had a very technical way of approaching things, and um, I ended up not working in technical fields for very long because I realized that some of the most important questions were not the technical questions, but rather the philosophical and social and political questions. And that the most important issues in our society were not the ones that could be solved by just like a marginal engineer applying his talents to through known methods to known problems. And we had to think more outside the box about these philosophical matters to get anywhere interesting. So I ended up doing that. I ended up founding Palladium magazine as an expression of that work. And now we're doing this AI conclave, this conference in Spain for a month to really dive into understanding this artificial intelligence situation on a philosophical level. And so I've been interested in artificial intelligence, even like the transformative implications of artificial intelligence. And I've been diving into that in quite deep ways occasionally for the last 10 years. And so I feel like I've got a pretty good understanding of the discourse around the whole thing and the technical ideas and sort of where people imagine that it's all going and what are the different factions and what are the dynamics of how the hype cycles work in this stuff. But looking at it now, I mean, especially sort of it's very timely because there's been some recent breakthroughs that have got everyone talking about it. But when I look at it, I realize again that while there are technical problems here to solve, there's sort of this larger question of what would it mean to solve those technical questions, and or what's the surrounding context and how we're thinking about this whole thing. Again, there's this huge philosophical component that when I really think about that, I notice it looks like everyone else is confused and I feel confused. And there are a bunch of things that I'm really excited to work through with you guys. And so I'm excited to get together in person in an environment that's very embodied with a bunch of other very smart people, just relaxing and thinking and talking and really trying to understand over the course of a month. I think that's going to be a very productive environment. That's something we've done not on this scale before, but in the smaller iterations that we've done like this, it's been always very productive to get our network together. And so I feel like we have a lot of very interesting kind of threads to pull on going in, especially in this philosophy, theology, epistemology, the humanities, in relation to this AI issue. And I'm very excited to kind of get to the bottom of it, come out of it with a much more sophisticated understanding of how to approach this whole issue.
Skinner, what's your background and where are you coming from here?
Well, I started out life planning to go into politics, and then life took me in slightly different direction. After college, I ended up going into software startups, mostly working in finance and intellectual property side of things, not in the technical fields. And so I've been paying attention to these questions for quite a long time now, and have lived through a couple of AI hype cycles at this point. And my academic background is in philosophy, economics, and political science, and so but my research actually for the last 10 years has been principally focused in psychology, because at the end of my studies of those other three fields, I concluded that at the end of the day, they're all fundamentally psychology. That how we make decisions about resources is fundamentally a psychological question. How we make decisions about how we allocate and distribute power in society, also a psychological question. And then in philosophy itself, this is, I think, that the core contribution that Wittgenstein made to the field of philosophy was sort of to point at the thinker, that the sort of underlying, and that, well, we can't separate the thought from the thinker at a very fundamental level. And so this led to my last 10 years of kind of deep diving into the works of Carl Jung, Soren Kierkegaard, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and quite a long list, but those three certainly have had outsized influence on my thinking, and actually also quite importantly, Henry Bergson, whose philosophy of time I think is quite critical, and he importantly influenced all of C.S. Lewis, W.H. Auden, and T.S. Eliot, and their own philosophies of time are more or less derivative of his. And so the reason I bring up time is that the thinker exists in a temporal context as much as in a spatial context, and so by temporal context, what I mean is an existence that is always undergoing change. Ultimately, that's what we can say time fundamentally is. It is the duration through change, and so we as humans have been trying to answer these fundamental questions of identity for as long as we've been, quote unquote, conscious, and part of that identity question has also been to define what it is to be conscious. What does it mean to, what is the difference between human consciousness and other forms of consciousness, etc. And so, machine intelligence is yet another problem, one of these hard problems for us to grapple with. It's another mirror that we have to look into, that reflects back to us our own suppositions about our consciousness and the consciousness in the world around. I think that we could also say that philosophy, or that psychology is the introspective version of theology, and theology is the projection of psychology. That they're sort of two sides of the same coin. There is sort of this self-consciousness, and the inward look at its operations is fundamentally what real psychological investigation is doing. And then, but we also project an understanding of the world outward from that inner working, and then we make certain conclusions, we extrapolate, we look at the other, and we either then we have these default modes of perception that are basically built on biases and heuristics, and so by default each of us is walking around with an assumption, for example, the other is fundamentally similar to myself or fundamentally different. And you can see these, those kind of default biases at work in the debate around AI. You have, the people that think that the machine is going to be this benevolent augmentation of human capacity, are projecting what are fundamentally their own kind of their self-view, that they're moral agent who would help others, and they're assuming that this is sort of the way the world is. And then when you see all these panicked people who are certain that AI is going to just chew us up and spit us out, I think that this often indicates that that's what they would do if they were so empowered. I think that it's a quite an insight actually into the minds and intentions of the thinkers. So, I think the exciting part about being in, and it's, I think the use of the term embodied is really useful and important here, because I think embodiment is also one of the kind of core questions around machine intelligence and consciousness. Can it really be conscious like human consciousness if it's not embodied in the same kind of survival sense that we are embodied? I think that's actually one of the core questions, if not the most important question. But the fact that we're going to be in person together having these conversations is interesting, because it gives us the opportunity actually to reflect as mirrors to each other over a course of time, and building relationships with one another, that we can kind of get into a lot of details about those thoughts and thought processes that you can't do in a Twitter conversation or something, where you're just kind of hurling one-liners back and forth. So, this is, I think, a unique opportunity to kind of like slow down and perform deep thought, rather than kind of do this hand-wringing thing and saying, people really should be doing deep thinking about these important questions, but instead they're just lobbing one-liners on Twitter.
Yeah, I think I'm really interested in this aspect of the apocalyptic thinking, because to my mind, that's the single feature that most distinguishes the discourse around AI from many other even very profound questions of technology and industrial society and so on. When you have, for example, just to take two quotes, first from Sam Altman of OpenAI, quote, "AI will probably most likely lead to the end of the world, but in the meantime, there'll be great companies," end quote. I think it was originally sort of a joke, but I believe he did say that. Second quote, Elon Musk of Tesla and SpaceX and and lately of Twitter X, quote, "Even benign dependency on AI/automation is dangerous to civilization if taken so far that we eventually forget how the machines work," end quote. Another quote from Elon, quote, "AI doesn't have to be evil to destroy humanity. If AI has a goal and humanity just happens in the way, it will destroy humanity as a matter of course without even thinking about it. No hard feelings," end quote. So why is it that this technology in particular gives rise to this type of thinking? And my null hypothesis, sort of, as I think about the history of the humanities and sort of Western thought and intellectual history, is this just the sort of the latest stage, the sort of almost like a kind of teleological endpoint of the type of, you could call it Faustian thinking, or thinking about the like Skinner, you're mentioning these assumptions about space and time that are kind of rooted in a lot of our preconceptions about even, I guess, technology and society and so on. Is AI almost just like the the perfect entity at the end of this kind of progress, or what? How do we make sense of it?
I think, yes, in some sense, AI is kind of this end stage of Faustian civilization. Like it's this constant kind of scientific, technical self-overcoming, building more and more external capability more and more calculation and so on. The kind of endpoint of that is, well, we build a machine copy of the human soul or something, right? That's kind of the idea that that lies at the end of that whole kind of thinking. With respect to like, why is there this apocalyptic thinking around that? I mean, so at the very simple level, I think maybe just because it is the end stage of the current cultural mode, we're not really going to think past that very effectively. It's sort of like, well, we reached the apocalypse, and then what else is there to do? But then I think there's also a reality to that. It's not just a psychological feature. There's a sort of it's not like, oh yeah, of course we all know life goes on and everything will be fine and nothing crazy will happen at all if you build that thing, and people are just being irrational about that. No, it's we actually don't know how to think beyond that in a non-millenarian sense. Like you have this advent of machines that, or this hypothetical advent of machines that are capable of doing every economic function and every political function that humans can do. That's the idea of AI, right? If that's what we're building, well, okay, now you have this thing that's presumably capable of, well, it's capable of doing everything that humans can do. Maybe it's better because we seem to be able to improve machine capital to be hundreds of times stronger than humans and faster and all these different things. Well, maybe why not smarter? And so then you have this idea, well, now the human as we know it has become obsolete in the face of this capital construction. And our entire existence is founded on our ability to effectively fill a material niche in the world through our skills, through our capabilities, through our intelligence largely, but obviously other things as well. And if we're supposing this construction that can, or set of constructions that can fill those niches and our niche better than we can, that is within that idea, that's the end of the line for humanity as we know it. And so then the question is not like, oh, there's some error being made where of course everything's going to be fine, but people are being irrational. It's okay, given that we think that this is possible and that it's fairly clear that if you built it, it's threatening this core niche, how do we think about that in a psychologically healthy way? Is the psychologically healthy way like, oh, actually, maybe we shouldn't be doing this whole Faustian thing at all? Or is it, well, it's going to be fine, we'll build it and we'll figure something out. Okay, what will we figure out? What is the sort of path through that? And so I think the apocalyptic thinking comes from like, there's like within the logic of the idea, there is this seemingly inevitable sort of end of at least humanity. And no one kind of has within this whole cultural apparatus found a way out of that that logic. People ignore it. People come up with all kinds of copes around it, but there's no clear path through it that isn't just the end of everything we know, the end of our culture and the end of our species, right? Because that's kind of what it's implying back to us. And so that's a very interesting thing to engage with. And I think it's going to take sort of quite a lot of philosophical sophistication and psychological sophistication to be able to like comfortably reason past that boundary and find maybe like resituate ourselves in that universe, or to find some flaw in that narrative that is an actually convincing path out.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of obvious flaws. One is just the assumption about value, or what humans.
What do you mean assumption about value?
You made an assumption about where human
value comes from material production.
Well, the human material existence comes from human material production.
Right, but you made a claim about value.
No, I'm not making a claim about value. I'm making a claim about material existence.
Okay, but then if you're not making the claim about value, then you're leaving open the possibility that humanity is valuable for a bunch of other things that
Sure.
have
Yeah,
nothing to do with.
right. Humanity is
But that's
valuable
one of
in a
the
bunch
things
of
that gets
ways.
elided in the
But
assumption
okay,
about inevitability of a
but what
certain
then what you're
process.
talking about is, okay, humanity is especially valuable, but humanity's material existence is threatened. Now we have the situation where the material existence of all value in the universe is threatened, and this leads to a lot of the claims that have been made around this space, where people are saying, well, they're actually, the AI future by default is this valueless future where there's no more human value, so there's nothing valuable. It's just this machine efficiency for the end until the end of time, and all the human stuff, which was the valuable stuff, has been materially destroyed. And so, yes, like material existence and value are two different things. Maybe the human has all the value, maybe it doesn't. Maybe there is value beyond that horizon. But the argument is the sharpest form of the argument is strictly with respect to the material existence of, can we afford our own flesh, right? That's really the question.
I mean, but are you arguing that humans are going to be destroyed by the machine, or that if our day-to-day lives are more or less replaced by the machine, that we won't find intrinsic value in living? Because those are two different existential questions.
Right. So that may be something, and I sort of fear that actually happens before we ever build any machine capable of filling our niche, is that we've already lost faith in our own sort of capacity for life.
One could say that we've reached that.
Yeah, one could say we've reached that already.
We may have already reached that, and that is a huge problem in our culture, right? But there's also this very material problem. There's two ways that I think the advent of a, let's say, an intelligent and superior competitor to our niche, like materially superior competitor to our niche, would threaten us. Way number one is it, yes, just wipes us out or whatever. Way number two is it doesn't wipe us out. It just exploits the niche more efficiently, to the point where the cost of energy and the cost of matter and the cost of food and the cost of oxygen sort of like cost, in the sense of how efficiently, how much work you have to do to get those things, that they rise to the point where human life becomes impossible, because there's just too much competition. The same way, like if you drop fish into a pond that formerly did not have fish in it, you wipe out it, the fish just very efficiently wipe out all the plankton, and now whatever was relying on the existence of the plankton is like suddenly no longer viable. And so the fish, not by directly destroying, let's say, the little water beetles that ate plankton, they don't necessarily eat them directly, but they eat everything they eat, and now they don't have any niche for existence anymore. They die. So those are two different ways that humanity could be threatened by this thing.
I understand the metaphor, but I'm a little unsure about like whether this is a viable direct comparison. I mean, like what do you envision? I mean, we always hear about the sort of paperclip maximization argument or whatever, but like in material terms, if we were to assume some kind of rational impulse on the part of the machine, and we also like this debate, this conversation is already presupposing that AI is going to be this unitary instrument. I mean, I think
no, I'm not proposing that it's a unitary thing. I actually don't believe that. I think a lot of people do believe in the sort of unitariness of the AI, and that's one of these like weird kind of philosophical theological assumptions that people make, and it has.
But they kind of start with this assumption. I mean, it's very common that people sort of out of the box. People really try to justify it.
Yes, people do make that assumption. I'm not making that assumption. Like I'm just talking about the existence of technology, the ability to manufacture intelligence and agency through industrial or some future process that sort of
but then from a teleological perspective, I mean, if we have this set of intelligences that are operating on inorganic substrates,
yes,
what then is what is the motivation for that intelligence on an inorganic substrate to compete directly? What is it competing with us on? Is it, oil and gas resources? Is it rare earth minerals? Because I think that these are actually the very specific, like what are they going to make that crowds us out?
Yeah, exactly. So that's a good question. This is one of these philosophical questions. It gets into the nature of how agency and value relate, and what kinds of things are likely to be pursued by non-human intelligence and so on. So at a very first approximation, it's like, well, whatever you construct it to pursue, it'll have some inbuilt drives or whatever. But then, that it may itself start mutate in some way. It may not stay on that course. But the paperclip argument comes out of the idea that, well, if you were a paperclip factory and you made your AI to maximize the paperclips in your factory, then at the point where it kind of like gets out of hand, it's still got this idea of building paperclips, and it just kind of tries to run some universal paperclip factory.
It's sort of the Fantasia argument.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The magician's assistant, right? And but you can imagine many such things, or you can imagine that they start reflecting on their own values and changing them, or just in some irrational way mutating. What those particular values are, actually, I don't think matters very much, because what's going to happen is, once you have strategic thought and agency attached to any particular value system, you get ideas like, well, it's valuable to have more resources, it's valuable to have more intelligence, it's valuable to have more security. And when you have a bunch of agents in the world competing for resources, intelligence, security, etc., what you end up with is competition. They start, at first just trying to get resources for themselves or for their tendency, or whatever, however you carve up that space. But then at some point, they are also competing with humans for those resources and competing with each other. Maybe there will be wars, right? This all gets very speculative, but the thing that feels very solid is like, once you have the constructed agency pursuing any particular goals, then if it is more efficient than humans at competing for resources, then we have this problem, right? We have this thing that can compete with us.
But a lot of this brings up, I think, so many, or it's sort of revealing of the structure of the meta problem here, or the meta problem set. For example, like, I just go to this epistemic place when I hear you say these things, because it's sort of like, okay, you can be out on a speculative branch of a speculative branch of like material science and so on, and be making any kind of extrapolation of how agency works in a different context, and say, well, because we know that animals behave this way, and we have these assumptions about natural selection and survival and so on, this would lead to our thinking about a non-human intelligence acting in that way. But for me, there's almost like this epistemic gap, which is something like, we know what we can see and observe and use our scientific method to do now with what exists. And then I see a bunch of people jumping to basically what I'm calling this theological, or Skinner is talking about as far as psychology, right? Like jumping to this projection, basically, of like what I can't prove scientifically, but what I can, what I really strongly believe, because it seems really real to me, based on basically a bunch of not improvable or not non-provable sort of axiomatic assumptions that are either unique to me or sort of things that I've received or inherited or whatever. What I'm curious about mostly is, how do you do the rigorous bridging of these two distinct epistemic domains, such that you can actually have a rigorous projection of
Can you?
well, or at the very least you can see it for what it is, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah,
Not
so that's
necessarily that, like, okay,
A
obviously,
transparent projection.
sure, like
Yeah.
basically a rigorous thinking about the process, whether it's psychological or something else, theological, inductive, whatever the sort of frame we want to put on it. But like, we're actually being very clear about what is on solid ground and what is speculation or what is belief in some non-scientific way. And for my mind, like, this is extremely important in sort of the history of science or Western thinking and epistemology. Like, you actually can't spend all of your energy on the imaginative speculation, because what happens is you crowd out the rigor of what you can actually intersubjectively prove, right? So it's not that, like, Isaac Newton or whoever didn't have all kinds of theories about things that went beyond the realm of what he could demonstrate, but what we view as science and that particular empirical tradition of knowledge is grounded in what you can actually prove, right? And so I guess this is my concern here.
Yeah, so this is what's so exciting about the conclave that we're about to run, is that we're going to be attempting to do that philosophical deep thinking on, okay, I've painted a picture here, which is basically, let's say, the natural outgrowth of the Faustian perspective on this whole, we think we can make AI according to these set of assumptions that we've inherited within the kind of Faustian culture. We think it'll have these effects because this is sort of how the thinking works. But yeah, so one of the things we have to do is go back and say, well, wait a minute, this is crazy. Like, this is a really interesting result. Let's go back and see, can we rigorously prove that? What assumptions do we have to make? What assumptions are we making? Is there something wrong with those assumptions? Are there other assumptions we could make? Can we end up in some whole different cultural frame of reference that seems more plausible to us that actually doesn't have this result? Or do we have to actually go and bite this bullet and sort of accept this result and work from there and nonetheless find value? Like that is the philosophical activity around this, right? It's like apply skepticism to that frame, but like to try to kind of find the cracks in it, or find the alternatives to it, or find what we actually know. Maybe it's just some big fever dream. Actually, all we know is something much less speculative than that. But that's going to be a very exciting activity. And that's what I'm looking forward to, is I think coming out of that conversation, I expect to have a much more rigorous and much more plausible and much more promising cultural direction than what we're going in with.
Skinner, I'm curious, I know you've done a lot of thinking and work on this idea of the machine, the mega machine, where these ideas of almost technics, you could say, as agent, where this is obviously not new in or maybe not obvious to some people, but this is I think clearly not actually a recent phenomenon. Maybe AI is actually just the latest iteration of a kind of strand of thought that has gone back quite a way.
Yeah, I mean, at least back to the beginning of what we call the Industrial Revolution. I mean, the replacement of human labor with machine labor, or work, in the pure physics sense of the use of the word work, the replacement of inorganic work, or by inorganic work of human labor. Certainly began all of these debates are rooted in that, and we are, whether we like it or not, influenced by the history of industrialization and the history of the responses to it, including, and not unimportantly, however you feel about it, Marxism, which is still, one of the most important and dominant critiques of industrialization. And a lot of these problems, our thinking is much more clouded by those old, 19th century debates than we realize. And I think that because there's the question of agency, which is also somewhat of this, like at an individual level and a community level, a voluntary delegation of agency that happens. So, and that delegation of agency, it doesn't necessarily mean that the thing that the process to which it's delegated actually has the agency. It just means that you no longer have it. So, like, we could say that we delegate our agency to techniques, to the supply chain, to a lot of these, like, we can call them forces, but what really it is inertia. Like, I'm not going to expend the energy to overcome the inert state in which I find myself, which is to change the state of affairs. And so whatever the kind of like default trajectory of inertia, that I'm okay with leaving it there. I mean, you could even say that the whole idea of machine intelligence and agency is just a grand accumulation of that inert energy, the refusal of somebody to take agency. I mean, because it assumes that we start with agency, and I don't think we do. I don't think that consciousness implies agency. So I don't think people are born into the world. I mean, they're certainly not born into the world with agency. A baby has no agency at all. Our default state is the opposite of agency. It's dependency, and so the question is really whether people, when they look out at at the point in life when they even realize that they could have any agency, they look out at the world and say, that doesn't look worth it. And then it looks like something else has this agency. I mean, if you think of in these terms of Adam Smith's invisible hand, the idea that the market has agency in this sort of invisible way, is really just what I'm talking about. Like, okay, well, I'm not going to do anything to change the nature of market incentives. I'm just going to feed them. It doesn't really mean that the market is the real thing that has agency and thought. It just means that you're choosing not to have it. So, I mean, this is definitely my view of these things. So I think that when we talk about the machine and techniques, it's really easy to create these abstract subjects, capitalize the letters, and then, it's a thing, a person almost. And I think this is really dangerous. I think just the grammar that we use, the way that we talk about these things starts to create lots of assumptions that don't necessarily bear out in empirical reality. And so, I think along with Wolf, I think one of the most important parts of this process is, if we're trying to move towards something that's more philosophically grounded, the way I would frame it is that we need to come up with a long list of falsifiable hypotheses. Like, rather than thinking of, well, what can we prove to be true? Well, we can't. I mean, at least in my epistemology, nothing can be proven to be true. It's just so far hasn't been proven false. And so we need to figure out what things might we try to prove false, so we can at least eliminate those from our map of reality through experiment. I mean, that is ultimately the way that real science progresses, is not in trying to prove some hypothesis true, but in sort of crossing off all the things that we can relatively safely assume aren't true based on the fact that they didn't bear out an experiment or an empirical observation. So go ahead. Yeah. No, go ahead.
One of the things that's most exciting to me about the conclave and the sort of broader work that we have to do here is this idea of doing the scholastic, really systematic process of thinking through formally
Hmm.
what is going on, what is being claimed, what is being assumed, and what can we actually know,
Right.
and what does that mean? On the agency point, and on the agency point, to my mind, one of the most fascinating reversals in basically Western thought has been in the last maybe 150 years, how we went from the sort of default ideological axiom of the British Foreign Office
Hmm.
in the late 19th century, or even earlier than that, but it was crystallized in this expression, men not measures, i.e. human agency, not sort of automaton, bureaucratic procedure or generalizable rule. And then in 44 years ago, we have this IBM slide that declared that a computer can never be held accountable, therefore a computer must never make a management decision, all the way up to the present, where you hear, not only is it everything from, know your customer compliance to just basically the imposition of bureaucracy, the imposition of rules onto almost everything as basically a supposedly value neutral or non-ideological position about what is actually going to lead to a better outcome, that sort of simply the imposition of a sort of proceduralization rather than
Well, I
a
wonder.
human judgment is
I I wonder
is
if it.
better.
I
Yeah,
wonder
I
if, in some
mhm,
sense, like the giving up of agency to these measures and markets and procedures is sort of the default state, as Skinner is implying, and
mhm,
you have to actually construct your own agency and train your own agency to some extent. And what's happened is, at a cultural level, just the collapse of agency, and so this leads to all these agency fictions and all these impositional procedures.
And so much of this comes from like legal liability. I mean, I would say that like way more of the things that we're talking about are downstream of legal liability in the aftermath of the alphabet soup agencies coming out of the New Deal and the administrative state, um,
Mm-hmm.
more or less creating a guilty until proven innocent context in which most economic actors are like that. That's our default context now.
mm.
And so as a
The
result,
so-called managerial revolution.
right, yeah, so
Yeah.
everybody is trying to cover their ass, and they don't want to be sued, they don't want to be fired, they don't want to be hauled before a review board. And so if they aren't actually the one making the decision, if it's outsourced to, whether it's a process, a metric, a machine, whatever, McKinsey, um, then they at least can say, well, it wasn't me. You can't blame me, you can't fire me, you can't sue me. And so of course, if at the point that everybody does that, then we are in a deterministic universe. But it
But
doesn't of course doesn't have to be that way. That's
so
just where we get after decades of that set of incentives.
that's very interesting. It leads me to think the lack of agency, the abdication of agency, is the result of a downside risk dominated in social environment, and
Well,
the agency is the result of a upside potential dominated environment.
well, I would
It's
say that it's the difference between a skin, what Taleb would call a skin in the game environment versus a neck on the line environment. Like, so
interesting.
Mm.
yeah,
Yeah.
like
Or
when
this idea in psychology of sort of loss aversion versus gain seeking, right?
Mhm.
right. Well, I mean, like at the point that I'm risking my capital and
Mhm.
I lose my own capital. Well, then that's it. But at the point that losing my capital also gets me hauled before the review board, also makes me unemployable because I'm put in the Gazette,
Hmm.
and whatever the additional social sanctions may be that go beyond whatever I put at risk, in order to provide enough extra protection, because you can't you can't allow caveat emptor to be a guiding principle in a society. At the point that you make all of those kind of assumptions, and you get things like the Securities Act and the Securities Exchange Act, and and the more heinous contemporary, Sarbanes-Oxley, where the CEO and CFO have to put themselves criminally into criminal potential liability for the verification of their financials. All of those things are all downstream of this like delegation of agency, or abdication of agency, and then more and more and more. So like at the point that that politicians want to get votes by creating enemies, and then those enemies happen to be people that perform relatively important managerial functions in society, then they say, well, I don't want to be a manager anymore, I'll hire somebody to be a manager. And then then if things go wrong, I'll blame them, and I'll keep my share capital, and I don't have to, I can then hire new managers if I have to fire the old ones and send them to prison. And I mean, this is the sad reality in which we're living. Whereas if you think about like why Swiss banks were, until the last 2 decades, quite impenetrably safe places to put your money, it's that they were general partnerships where the general partners bore unlimited liability for the debts of the bank. So if the bank is wiped out, then the general partners who run the bank they had their homes repossessed and they're gone, all their assets liquidated. And so of course they're never going to go bankrupt. But at the point that you can be Lehman Brothers, and the CEO, CFO, board of directors can say, well, we didn't know, it wasn't us, you don't look at me, then you get this catastrophic explosion of risk. And then when it blows up, you get more regulations, and then this pushes it farther and farther and farther.
I mean, what's so interesting about this is like maybe then to bring it back to the AI thing, and part of the reason people fear the machine is that, well, the machine will have agency because a computer cannot be held accountable, right?
Well, right.
It's sort of this assumption is like, well, you can't hold the machine accountable, so then it won't have all these limitations that we have, right?
Exactly.
It's sort of subconscious.
It's why the managerial class is running toward it, because they're saying, alas, we can be true.
Right, at least something. We can say,
look at the machine, the algorithm.
I mean, it's very interesting because one of the other quotes that I had, one of the other strains of thought here is sort of what you could call woke AI, or the idea that reducing bias and particular disproportionate impact of the technology is sort of ought to be the priority of all of the discourse around AI safety. And this all reminds me though of it's like how much of this is ultimately just a sort of buck passing exercise of using the technology to do things that would be too potentially fraught for a human to take responsibility for such an action, right? And I think that's actually the part of someone like Timnit Gebru's argument that I really endorse, which is the idea that like, yeah, there's totally this way in which people will use computer systems to basically launder the responsibility for getting an outcome they want, but not having to basically take responsibility for having been the decision maker or the sort of, even if they are some sort of subtle architect of the process that still led to the same.
Right. And what they're saying is actually, no, you are accountable for the thing that your AI system does. You sort of not necessarily accountable in all the ideal ways that we would like, but accountable in the way that at least sort of politically accountable for your system. But then that also leads to this, like Skinner's saying again, this kind of persecution of agency, right? It's well, you're not even allowed to make a computer programmed to make these decisions. It's just, you're not allowed to do anything.
It sort of brings to mind the story arc in The Lord of the Rings, where you have Gollum, who needs to get rid of Frodo so that he can get the ring back. I mean, and he's driven exclusively. I mean, Gollum is, as a character, sort of represents the loss of meaningful agency, right? You know, you have like somebody whose mind has been completely twisted toward and prostituted to the service of power. I mean, at least my interpretation of this sort of metaphor of Gollum. And what does, but you know, Gollum is not that he's strong, but you know, there's always the possibility that that he might get caught trying to do the thing he's going to do, and then he would, you know, be killed or something. And so what does he want to do? He wants to have Shelob, the spider, she can take care of this. We can take them there, and then I can get what I want, but not be held accountable for it. I think this is actually a really strong metaphor for the whole agentic problem that we're talking about here in the realm of capitalism. Because actually, I don't think we would be having any of these arguments about agency around AI in this context if we had some hypothetically other economic system in, you know, as a context for which this is taking place. You know, like, I mean, I think that this is like, it's really key to see that the materialism question isn't just about like whether we get replaced, but it's also as the pre-existing incentive environment is part of the story here. Like, it's part of why it's going in this direction rather than in some other direction. And so we also should see that there's going to be, and already has been, of course, you know, reflexive responses to each stage of development. So I think this is also one of the problems that I have with the people that talk about, well, on this path, AI will at this, you know, arbitrary point in the future look like whatever. Well, but this assumes that you can just like draw that line and that there aren't going to be reactions and disruptions to it. And in fact, there always are.
Yeah, Wolf and I were even just discussing yesterday how, of course, you can think about, for example, we've seen these amazing developments in computer vision that are sort of the latest
and computer generation of imagery.
Yes, the latest development. Of course, there's sort of what the possibility of the technology, there's what the narrow technical possibility makes possible. And then there's how it actually gets absorbed and responded to with human culture. And I think probably there tends to be too much focus on, you know, capabilities as such, and way too little focus on how do the capabilities or the advent of such capabilities get absorbed and reacted to by this like complex reflexive social set of circumstances.
Yeah, and the thing you were saying that I thought was interesting on that front is, you know, when someone puts out AI, or at first it was all very impressive, you know, it gives this immediate impression of being like this impressive art of the kind that some artist would spend a huge amount of time producing. And then you look closer and you realize, oh wait, there's all these little deviations from what I would expect, like there's too many fingers, or there's two hands, or in where there shouldn't be, or all these little things, or the more subtle things. And now it's to the point where, you know, you put out AI art and everyone can recognize it as such, and the humans have learned, the social system around
right.
it.
So there's a reinforcement learning that happens with the machine. There's a reinforcement learning that happens on the machine side, but there's also a reinforcement learning that happens on the human side. And I don't think we pay nearly enough attention to like what those processes look like. Guys, I think this is a great conversation. I think we should wrap it up though. And just quickly before we go, yes, we will continue to have many more of these. What just quickly, what do people need to know about the AI Conclave, and why
Yeah.
should they come?
So if you're capable and interested in having these kinds of discussions, especially sort of at the intersection of the technical possibility and the philosophical rigor, we'd be very interested in having you there. You should apply. It's a very simple process. Just send in your application, give us a few logistical details. In particular, something you should know, you don't have to come for the whole month. Maybe come for a week, come for a few days. Depending on what your schedule allows, we'd love to see you there. We'll be there the whole time, really diving into it. But we'd love to see a whole variety of people. So if you're at all interested, you should apply.
I think that there'll be few environments you'll find that you'll have the opportunity to both connect with the diversity of minds and perspectives that we're going to have there, and in the environment of being fully embedded in Mediterranean nature, surrounded by Mediterranean pine forest and around 30,000 acres of hiking trails through in the park where the estate sits, which is just a stone's throw from the sea. And I think that we will have a lot of these conversations, not even sitting in chairs, but walking around the forest, listening to the birds and listening to the waves of the sea. And I think that will change the whole tenor of the experience, and definitely not your average tech event.
Right.
Well, Skinner and Wolf, thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt.
Talk
Thanks,
to you
guys.
soon.